I'm building the base frame for this outdoor bar entirely out of pine 4x4s, and first up is to cut those to length. This patio bar is going to live, well, outdoors on a patio, which means the joinery needs to be really strong, and to do that I'm going to use half-lap joints. Now half-lap joints are exactly what they sound like they are. I'm going to cut in half the thickness of the material on both pieces, and then those two pieces are going to mate and overlap. Now there are lots of different ways to cut half-lap joints, and I'm going to show several of those methods in this video, but what I think is the easiest and what's accessible to most people is using a circular saw and a straight edge. To save time, I'll gang cut these half-laps by clamping them together once they're aligned. And I use this piece of 4x4 to lay out those cut lines. I set the depth of the circular saw to cut exactly halfway through and then started cutting notches through the section that will become the half-lap joint. And now the really satisfying part, breaking off all those little slats. Okay, well, cutting those half laps with the circular saw went pretty well, but now I'm going to jump over to using the table saw. Like I said, I want to be able to show you guys different techniques, and with my setup, I think this will go a lot faster. And I'll use my Rockler crosscut sled. It's got a positive stop that I can adjust, and it's going to help me make those repeatable cuts. While the circular saw is a more accessible / DIY method, using the table saw and a crosscut sled yielded better, more accurate results. Now I've got all those pieces cut and the half laps notched, I can begin assembling the frame starting with these two frame sections. I'm only using glue to put this frame together, which is really all you need. With this half lap joint structure and all the surface area to connect those pieces, these joints are plenty strong without any need for screws or dowels. I clamped up all the joints and left the glue to dry overnight. The next day I pulled the frames out of the clamps and did a bit of sanding to remove any excess glue squeeze out. After picking the best sides of the frames and which legs to use to show on the front of this bar, I glued up the remainder of the frame. With the frame done, I'll focus on making the concrete slab for the countertop of this outdoor bar, and first up is making the form out of melamine. I like to assemble my forms by pre-drilling and driving in screws, and then add paste wax before applying silicone caulk to seal all the edges. Next, I covered my workbench in plastic and leveled the form so I get a consistently flat pour. Okay, so I've got my form ready to go. It's nice and level. I've got my concrete, my water, a shovel, a hoe, a bucket to mix it in, a mask, some gloves, eye protection. Am I missing anything? Let's pour some concrete. I'm using Quickcrete's high strength mix, and I combine that with water, mixing with the hoe until I get this pancake batter-like consistency. Next, I can shovel the mixture into the form, and I use that hoe to work the concrete into all the corners and edges. I mixed up a second bag of concrete and filled up the remainder of the form until it's just above the top of the form. I use the hoe to pat down the surface and then chop the concrete into all the edges to ensure there's no gaps. Last, I use a 2x4 to screed the surface, and I want it as flat and smooth as possible so it will sit evenly on top of the frame. That pour went pretty smooth. I used a little bit more concrete than what I anticipated, almost 2 full bags, which means this sucker is gonna be heavy. I've got it all covered up in plastic, that way it doesn't cure too fast and cause cracks. I'll take this off after a day and then let it cure an additional day before I pop it out of the mold. And then we're gonna cover the whole thing in epoxy, and it's gonna be awesome. So the cooler for this patio bar is gonna live on this side. So I need to make all the panels that are gonna be the door and then close off the rest of the base. And to build those panels, I'm gonna use these 1x8 cedar planks. First up, I cut the cedar boards to their rough height for the panels, giving myself about 1 inch of wiggle room so I could cut them to fit after the glue up. Then I cut them into 2¼ inch wide planks. Last, I glued all those strips into cedar panels. Now, it's important not to add too much clamping pressure because with boards this thin, they have a tendency to bow up on you, and adding a clamp to the top of the panel also helps to keep them nice and flat. Okay, moving on to fitting the cooler into the frame. I totally didn't plan for it, but a 2x4 scrap stacked on a 4x4 scrap gave the exact height needed to allow the cooler to sit high enough that the lid was just above the surface of the frame. There is a coffee shop here in town that I frequent quite often, and it's got these concrete countertops all the way around the coffee bar, and they're completely covered in epoxy. And I've always been a big fan of how that looks. The epoxy itself's got a real nice subtle swirl pattern to it. you still get the hardness of the concrete while having a nice smooth surface of the epoxy. And the thing I like the most is all those little defects and cracks and divots that are in the concrete. You still can see those through the epoxy, so it still has a bit of an industrial vibe. When I saw it, I knew that I had to try it in a project, and literally this entire project was built around the idea of just trying out that technique. Now, I've never poured epoxy on concrete, so this is definitely an experiment for me, and I'm gonna try it using Total Boat's tabletop epoxy. Now, this first layer is going to be a base coat, and because of the sugi bond finish that I did on the base of the actual bar itself, I kind of want to pull that whole theme into the concrete top. So I'm going to do some black pigment here. Actually need a little bit more. This stuff is messy. Well, disaster averted on that one. What I didn't realize is that as I started rolling the edges, it was picking up some of the loose concrete and then transferring that gritty concrete onto the surface. So luckily I realized it pretty quickly, and that's why you saw me start squeegeeing everything off. I think the solution is to treat the edges first, let that dry, and then come back and do that base coat. But now we know. Now we know. After a day, I sanded the top and the sides with 220 grit sandpaper, and this allows the next layer of epoxy to adhere properly to that first layer. I poured on the top layer of the base coat and then use a squeegee to spread it all out. While I'm waiting on the epoxy to cure, I'm cutting panels to build the cabinet on the left side of the base opposite of the cooler. I cut these to friction fit into the frame and then glued some blocking and shot in some brad nails to hold it while that glue dries. For the door of the cabinet, I needed to add some extra thickness to the door panel, so I had thick enough material to attach hinge hardware. And I accomplished this by cutting a piece of 1/4 inch Baltic birch plywood and then gluing that onto the back of the panel. Next, I cut some pieces of Baltic birch and glued up a frame that I'll use to close off the top of the void where the cooler sits. I traced the shape of the cooler onto the frame, and then I cut this out with a jigsaw using a scroll cutting blade. And now for the part of this project that I am the most excited for. I'm gonna do that final coat of epoxy using this Total Boat tabletop epoxy. And I'm going to do another coat of black like this first coat, but then I'm gonna feather in this copper looking mahogany, this pearl white, and some of this silver metallic gray to hopefully give it a natural marbled looking texture that matches the aesthetic of the rest of the outdoor bar. Hopefully I can pull it off. I don't know, I've never done this before, but like I said, I'm super excited to try, so let's go ahead and dive in. God, I am like dripping sweat. That was stressful, and it's hot in my shop, and I can't have the fan on because I don't want to blow sawdust in this thing. But holy, that is the most beautiful epoxy pour I've ever done, hands down. That is amazing. It looks so good. It looks better than my wildest dreams. Oh, okay. Enough bragging. I drilled in some pocket holes and added the remaining cabinet side panels and that back cedar/plywood panel to the base frame. To attach the left side panel, I used wood glue to secure it to the plywood panel behind it and then shot in some brad nails to hold it while the glue dries. I routed a chamfer on the edge of the door panel and then added the concealed hinge hardware. With the door hung, I drilled holes and attached the door handle. I sanded off all the epoxy drips from the concrete countertop and then placed it on the base so I could use that to reference the lid frame that I need to make next. To build up the height of the lid frame, I cut 45-degree miters on these cedar strips and then glue these on using the wood and CA glue trick. The wood glue provides a long-term bond, while the CA glue allows me to rapidly fixture these pieces and acts as a clamp while the wood glue dries. Next, I added this piece of 2x4 to the back lid frame and glued in 2 layers of cedar strips to the front lid frame. This is going to give me enough material to cut in the recess for the hidden hinges I'm using for the lid. And I recently watched the video by Michael Alm showing how to install these sauce hinges, and I recommend you check it out if you want a good tutorial on how it's done. I made this quick drawer, which is designed to pull out on 2 drawer slides and then hold liquor and wine bottles that are stored inside the spar cabinet. I also added this partition and a shelf that gives a spot for all the glasses to be stored inside the cabinet. To better insulate the cooler lid, I drilled some holes and sprayed in some foam insulation. I get mesmerized watching the spray foam slowly ooze out, and of course I had to share it in my Instagram stories. Speaking of, are you following me on Instagram? I'm super active on Instagram, and it's the best way to reach out if you have any comments or questions. I removed the drain plug and used a step bit to widen that hole big enough to fit this 1/2-inch coupler. And I'll link all the parts I used down below, and I'm also considering writing plans for this build, so let me know if that's something you all would like to see. While I love the way this epoxy pour came out, I don't love the high gloss sheen of the countertop covered in epoxy. I sanded back the epoxy first with 220 grit sandpaper and then sanded my way up to 1000 grit. I made sure to clean off the top thoroughly with water and a rag before applying the finish. And speaking of the finish, I'm using one of my favorite finishes, and that's Odie's oil. Hashtag not sponsored. It's super easy to apply, it's all natural, it's food safe, and it just smells nice. It gave me that exact low sheen luster I was looking for, and I just can't get over how good this countertop looks. It looks like real marble. I'm planning a full tutorial on this epoxy marble process, so make sure you're subscribed and belled so you don't miss that. I placed the countertop onto the base so I could use that for a reference to install the lid. I needed a bit of extra height so the cooler lid would make contact with the underside of the cedar lid, so I used this Total Boat epoxy adhesive to attach this 1/4-inch plywood panel to the top of the cooler lid. I installed the cedar lid and then attached the back piece to the base frame with 4 of these L brackets. I added a liberal amount of epoxy adhesive to the top of that 1/4-inch panel and then closed the cedar lid on top of it. The next day I checked it to find that the lid fit perfectly into the cooler, and man, I love it when a plan comes together.
I rolled on this TotalBuilt Halcyon varnish, which brings out all those deep, rich tones that really makes those cedar panels pop against that sugi bond finish. I added a lid support arm and then some plywood to act as blocking for the cedar strips that I'll frame the panel in with. I added blocking to the right side of the frame and then used those to attach the cedar panels that cover in where the cooler sits. Now I can attach all the drain plumbing, and I made sure to use Teflon tape at all the joints. The end panel slots over the pipe, and then I added this block to attach the spigot to. And this whole assembly is removable if need be. I reinstalled that drawer and reattached all the hardware, and once the bar top was delivered to its new home, I used the epoxy adhesive to hold the countertop in place. And with that, this outdoor bar was done.